Hi, I'm James from Chaosium. I sat down with Mike Mason and we talked about how Call of Cthulhu scenarios have changed over the years. We talked about what scenarios were like when they first started coming out in the early 80s. We talked about what they were like a couple of years ago. We talked about what they are like today. And we talked about what they might be like in the future. I'm going to jump across to that interview in just a moment. But first, remember to subscribe to the Chaosium YouTube channel. It helps us out and it lets us make more content like this. Thanks.
It's an interesting question because you can see to some degree what an original Call of Cthulhu story written in 1981, 2 or 3 looks like, because it would be something like The Haunting, which is obviously still available today. Now, obviously, if you look at today's version of The Haunting, there is new material in that wasn't in the original. There is more investigation in terms of there's an ability, if your characters want to do more investigation before you go to the haunted house, that's been written into the modern day version of The Haunting, because we wanted to encourage investigation and also to allow people to investigate, and rather not so. The original, if I remember correctly, it had a little bit of investigation, but not a great deal. A lot of it was very much kind of, if they do this, you're kind of going to have to just make it up on the fly. And obviously, as a beginner scenario in today, we didn't want to land new keepers with the kind of, you're still learning to play the game. We're now going to tell you you've got to make up the scenario as well as you go. We wanted to provide a bit more support than originally was there. So that's one of the differences. There's more support in modern day scenarios than old scenarios. There is more, there are more there's more guidance for the keeper in terms of, here's what you can do now, or here's some alternatives, or here are 3 different ways that players could interact with this story, or 4 different ways that they could reach a climax that are all very different. Whereas in the original scenarios, there was none of that. There was, very little in terms of advice or guidance for the keeper on how to run it or how it could run. It was presented very much more kind of matter-of-factly, as in, here are some rooms, here's what's in the rooms, and here are some stats of monsters and people in the rooms. There was very little in terms of what the NPCs look like. Maybe a line, but there was no consistency of description to say every NPC, here's a quick one line that you can give to the players of what they look like. Here's their agenda, here's their traits or whatever. There's not really any of that. And so again, you had to make all that up on the fly. And again, if you're not particularly comfortable or great at improvising, that can be a tough ask. It can be very quite grey game in a way, because you're only focusing on the action and the stats rather than the atmosphere and the color and the setting. So there's a lot of that's a big difference. And I guess in a way, the way I characterize this is, the game that most people had come into role playing into in the late 70s and early 80s was obviously D&D. And D&D, as back in that day, and obviously things have changed, as we over the last 40 years or more, but certainly back in the day, they were about dungeons, weren't they? They were basically, there was very little in terms of motivation of why you're going into dungeon. You literally, you're at the door of the dungeon. That's the start. Doesn't matter how you got there or why you're there. You are there, and the mission is you're going inside and exploring through the dungeon and killing everything that moves and taking everything you can find. That's the premise of the very early kind of dungeons in that sense. And so many other role-playing games, not just Call of Cthulhu, were informed by that setup, that kind of game agenda. So a lot of the very early Call of Cthulhu scenarios are effectively a bit like a dungeon. It may have been like a country house rather than a dungeon, but literally there's some spooky things going on in that country house. What spooky things? We're not quite sure, but you should go and look at it. Okay, so we'll go and look at it. Not really much motivation there, but we'll just buy into it. That's cool. We'll go there and we'll explore the haunted house and actually find it's full of ghouls or whatever. And, and so that leads you on to the other thing that's slightly different these days, is most of the time back in the day, Call of Cthulhu scenarios would end in a fight. It was assumed that, yes, you would have a fight with the monster, even though you would probably die unless you run away and not really solve the scenario. It was, they were set up to be fights. Some of them, some of them are a bit more imaginative. You could do a ritual and banish things and all that kind of thing. That's all good. But even still, many scenarios, even if it wasn't the climax, at some point during the scenario, it was expected that you would have a fight, because it's a role-playing game, and having a fight is fun, and that's the kind of the thought process of a lot of role-playing games, from back in the day. And obviously nowadays, we still accept, you may have a fight here, but here's some, we try and also to pepper in alternatives. So, well, if they don't need to fight, they could sneak away here, or they could, charm their way out of this, or they could cast a spell and do, we try and give the keeper some hints that they can hint to the players or lead the players on, so they're not just being barreled down one route through the encounter. It's not always going to be a fight. They could, come up with some really cool idea to avoid the fight. Great, because we do try and tell people that fighting in Call of Cthulhu is probably, not an optimal thing a lot of the time, because your probably characters are going to die. So avoiding fighting is a good thing. So coming up with reasons in the scenario how they can do that is what we try and do more of in the modern day. But it's still accepting that sometimes there will be a fight, and that's cool.
I want to ask you the same question, but I want to pull the scope way back in. What was different about how you were writing scenarios 5 or even 3 years ago compared to how they're written now?
I think it's all about presentation. I don't think the scenarios themselves have changed that much, in a sense, apart from what I've just said about building in more optionality, more different types of motivation, and help for the keeper to run them. But I think it's about format and function. And it all comes down to, in the old days, the secret of a scenario, as in who's the big bad, what's actually going on, usually wasn't in the first page of the scenario. You would have to read the entire scenario to get to the climax, which would then reveal to you, the keeper, what was actually going on. And that kind of makes no sense, does it? If you're running the game, you need to know that at the start, so you can, build the scenario in an appropriate way so it gets that kind of, that kind of climax. So one of the things, that has certainly changed in the, certainly through in 7th edition is, we try and tell people up front, what's the mystery? What's going on? What the scenario may be a mystery for the players. It should never be a mystery for the keeper. The keeper should know as soon as possible, what is this scenario about? What's going to happen? How might it end? So it's like, if it's like, it's like, the villain is, Dr. Smith. He's in league with a vampire. So they're the baddies. They're trying to, take over this town. That's their agenda. And if they do it, they're going to blow up the town in some massive celestial kind of gate thing that's going to rip a hole in the earth and kill many, many, many thousands of people. That's the horrible outcome. Who's doing it and how? Yeah. Okay. I now understand what this scenario is about. Let's get into actual detail of what happens. So that is what's different. And so I'm building on top of that is it's providing information to the keeper in a manageable and logical way. So what we try to do is present the information to the keeper in a way that they're going to be presenting it to the players. So it's the logical order. So any scenario is going to start with some sort of start scene, where somebody is recruiting the players, or the players are driving and they get run off the road by a giant bat, or whatever it may be. But it's clearly, we label that as a start scene, so the keeper knows that's what I need to do first. That's the first scene I'm going to run. And then from that, we then start to build in like links and things. So from that scene, you could go to now scene B or scene E, because, if they saw the they saw the giant bat. They want to go and follow the giant bat. They need to go to scene E, whatever that's called. And if they want to go to the strange looking house through the woods, which is the opposite direction to that, that's scene B. So, okay, there's two options they can do. Or maybe the third, they can carry on driving. What do they do there? Well, that's scene F. Okay, so we link them up so the keeper can navigate through much more easily, but they follow a logical course in terms of the timeline of the scenario. So in a sense, you know, I don't find I need to do a lot of preparation work if I'm running a scenario from a published scenario from one of our books, because they're laid out in a logical way that I just follow that as I run through. And I just need to remember, you know, are they going to the house or going to see the giant bat? Well, that's the scene I'm going to. And, you know, other than a couple, you know, read it through a couple of times, make a couple of little notes. I don't need to kind of work out the order of the scenario because we've written the order to follow that way. And again, some of the older scenarios didn't, some of them did that. Some of them were a little bit more, some information would be hidden around around it. You know, you'd have something about this scene, and then you'd have that scene taking place in a certain room, but you now need to go to the other end of the scenario to look at the room that scene's taking place, because that's got some other information and you need to buy. So literally for one encounter, you had two pieces of information in two different parts of the scenario rather than in one piece. If you know what I mean. It's not always easy to do this, but you're trying to make the keeper's life as easy as possible by presenting the information in effectively bite-sized portions that make in a logical order that make logical sense, if that makes any sense.
It makes perfect sense. I have one last question for you, and that is about the future. We know what scenarios were like in the past. 10 years from now, what do you think will be different about the way we do scenarios, and what do you think might be the same? What do you think might have carried through all the way from when this began?
I think it all comes down to whatever you can do to, you know, that core principle of how do you make the game as easy as possible to run, and so you get the most out of it, so you enjoy it as not only as the keeper but the players. So things going forward, it may be, you know, I don't know, you know, trying to reduce the onus on the keeper to some degree. You know, that they haven't got to do all the work necessarily, that there's more things are done for them, that they can just plug and play, as it were, or there's, you know, expectation on the players that they're going to do some of this. That might, you know, build into things. There's a whole kind of technology thing, which is a complete kind of, you know, dead end really, because it's like, well, you know, in the future robots will be running the games for us and we don't have to jam at all. We'll be other players and we'll enjoy them and have the robots running them. You know, maybe that'll happen. I don't know. Maybe your phone can be the GM, or maybe you can be the GM and the phone is your player, and I don't know. But ultimately it's about trying to ensure that you are supporting and facilitating people that want to get together and share an experience which is built around the frame of a story. You know, that's ultimately what it is. And whatever we can do in terms of publishers, in terms of how we present the information, how the information is conveyed, that helps people to enjoy and make the most of that experience, is ultimately the kind of the qualitative steps we're always trying to take and move forward with. You know, there's no one answer to how a scenario should be presented. There are many people who tell you what they think it should be presented as, but there's no one size fits all, and everyone is different. So it's trying to find the best balance of those in terms of how information is presented. You know, that's really the challenge for everyone who presents role-playing material. And as I say, despite what many podcasters will tell you, there is no one correct way to do it. There are many different ways, and all have different kind of, you know, pluses and minuses. And it's finding the right balance of all of those. And that's a continuing learning process, you know, that we go through and we continue to strive for. You know, as you say, if you look at our scenarios that we're putting out now to what we put out 7 years ago, they are slightly different. You can see there is a clearly more guidance for the keeper. There's clearly more kind of, I don't want to say hand holding, but a little bit of hand holding to guide people through. It's assumed that not everyone is an expert keeper. It's also assumed that not everyone is a beginner either, but both have to be taken into account. How do we balance a scenario and information that could be run by somebody who's just starting to play Call of Cthulhu and somebody who's been playing for 30 plus years? That's, in reality, you'd be presenting very different pieces of information to those two people. However, as a publisher, you're really the luxury of presenting one scenario in two different ways. So you're trying to find the middle of the road that serves both, and allows them both to, have a great experience with their friends at a gaming table. And that's the constant dilemma of role-playing games, is balancing, inexperience and experience. Because, I get experienced players who will give it me in the ear about, why are you telling us to do this? We know that already. Yeah, I know you know that. And, I know. You don't need to tell me. I'm you. I know that already. I don't need to tell myself how to do it. But I do need to tell somebody who's never played before. And they go, oh, yeah, that's a good point. And that's, that's the way I say it. And that's why we also try and, signpost scenario books in a way, like Doors to Darkness and so on, Gateway Surrey, try and say, well, these are kind of beginner scenarios. They are written from more inexperienced keepers. And so, experienced keepers don't have to buy them. They can go and buy Masks or Mansions of Madness, which are more complex scenarios that where that kind of experience will help them. So it's balancing the range, balancing the actual format within each scenario as well. That's the job we have now, and it's a job that we will continue to have as we go forwards.